Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of things that are strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because that is all we do. 3, 4, maybe 5 times a week. So if that is of interest to you, please gently offer a friendly handshake to the like button, but then unexpectedly pull away right before contact, leaving it looking confusingly at its own palm. Now, today's story is about a place. It is not on any official map, and you won't find it listed in any travel brochure. It is a secret whispered between seasoned hikers, a cautionary tale told over fading campfires. They call it the Lost Creek Wilderness, located somewhere in the rugged, unforgiving terrain on the border of Oregon and Washington. But within that wilderness, there is a specific unnamed valley that those in the know refer to by a much more chilling moniker, the forest where time runs backward. Now, for most of us, time is the ultimate unbreakable rule. It flows in one direction, forward. Past becomes present, present becomes future. But what if there was a place on this earth where that fundamental law of the universe just didn't apply, where logic dissolved and the impossible became the everyday? This is the story of 3 people who decided to find that place, and they found a warning so silent yet so terrifying it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Chapter 1: The Seekers. Our story begins in the fall of 2019. It was a beautiful autumn, the kind that calls out to anyone who loves the outdoors. Elias Thorne, Sarah Jenkins, and David Chen were not your average day hikers. They were seasoned veterans. We are talking about people who spent their weekends scaling technical peaks, mapping uncharted cave systems, and surviving on minimal gear. Elias, in his late 40s, was the group leader. He was a stoic, pragmatic man with a beard full of gray and eyes that had seen a lot of wilderness. He was the kind of guy who didn't speak much, but when he did, you listened. Sarah, 52, was the navigator. She was a retired cartographer who could read a landscape like a poem. She had spent 30 years looking at topographies and could spot a geological anomaly from a mile away. And David, the youngster of the group at 45, was the tech skeptic. He was an electrical engineer who believed that every mystery had a logical, mechanical, or geological explanation. To David, ghosts were just drafts and monsters were just shadows. They had heard the rumors about the Lost Creek Wilderness for years, specifically the story of the Reverse Valley. It was said that hunters who wandered in would emerge days later, claiming their watches had spun counterclockwise or that they had seen rain falling up. Most people dismissed these as hallucinations caused by altitude or dehydration, but Sarah had found something interesting in the archives of a defunct local historical society, an unpublished diary from 1925 belonging to a prospector named Jedediah Smith. The final entries of Jedediah's diary were fragmented and increasingly chaotic. He wrote about trees growing downward into the soil and the sun rising in the west. His last entry was a single, sprawling sentence. I am younger today than I was when I arrived, and I am terrified of what I will become tomorrow. That diary was all the motivation they needed. They were looking for the ultimate adventure, something that defined their lifetime of exploration. They packed enough supplies for a 5-day trek into one of the least mapped sectors of the Pacific Northwest. David packed specialized global positioning system units, barometers, and even a magnetometer, eager to disprove the supernatural rumors. It is probably just a magnetic anomaly messing with equilibrium, David had said as they loaded their packs at the trailhead. Or, Elias replied, tightening his straps, it is exactly what the diary says. Sarah smiled, looking at her compass. There is only one way to find out. They set off under a clear sky, the air crisp with the scent of pine and decaying leaves. The first 2 days were demanding but normal. They navigated ridgelines, crossed glacial streams, and camped under a canopy of stars. It was pure wilderness, untouched and beautiful. But on the 3rd morning, as they approached the deep, bowl-shaped valley that Sarah had identified as the location of the Reverse Valley, the atmosphere began to shift. Chapter 2: The Silent Shift. Now, you have to understand, these three were hyper aware of their surroundings. They knew the feel of a healthy forest. They knew how the wind sounded through the Douglas firs and how the birds should be calling to one another. But as they crested the final ridge and began their descent into the valley, a heavy silence settled over them. It was not a peaceful silence. It was oppressive, like the air was too thick to carry sound. Sarah was the first to notice something wrong. She checked her wrist, looking for her dependable, Swiss-made mechanical watch. "That is strange," she muttered. Elias stopped. "What is it?" "My watch," she said, holding it up. It stopped. David chuckled. "Battery dead?" "It does not have a battery, David. It is automatic. It whines with my movement, and I have been moving for 3 days straight." They all stopped and checked their own gear. David's battery-operated digital equipment was still on, but he frowned at the screen. "Satellite reception is garbage down here," he said. "The coordinates are jumping all over the place. According to this, we are currently moving at 300 miles per hour toward the North Pole." "And what about the time?" Elias asked. David clicked through the menus. "The time is... wait. It says it is 4 in the morning on January 1st, 2000. Elias looked up at the sun, which was high in the sky, well past its zenith. It was clearly late afternoon. "Well," he said, his voice grave, "I guess your magnetic anomaly theory is holding up, David." They decided to push on. They were experienced. A broken watch and a glitchy global positioning system wouldn't stop them. They figured they would just hike to the valley floor, take some photos, document the magnetic weirdness, and prove the legend was just that, a legend. But the forest itself began to defy their expectations. As they descended, the composition of the trees changed. On the ridge, it had been classic old-growth Douglas fir and hemlock. But in the valley, the trees looked different. Their bark was too smooth, too unblemished. There was no moss on the north side, and the undergrowth was thick and vibrant, looking like the peak of spring rather than the twilight of autumn. Sarah, looking at the map she had drawn from historical descriptions, pointed toward a small, meandering creek on the valley floor. "We should follow that creek," she suggested. Jedediah mentioned a specific bend where the anomaly was strongest. They followed the water. It was a beautiful, crystal-clear stream, bubbling over ancient stones. They stopped for a lunch break on a large, flat rock. Elias took a bottle of water from his pack, unscrewed the cap, and took a long drink. As he was setting the bottle back down, his hand slipped. The half-full bottle tipped over, and the water began to pour out onto the rock. Or rather, it should have poured out. Elias, Sarah, and David all stared, frozen, at the spilled water. Instead of spreading across the flat surface of the rock, the water was pooling in a single, perfectly spherical globule. And then, slowly, impossibly, the water began to flow up the slope of the rock, gathering itself back together and poured itself back into the bottle. The final drop detached from the rock and snapped back into the bottle's opening. Elias held the bottle, his hand trembling slightly. It was half full again. The rock was completely dry, no watermark, no dampness. A cold shiver, unrelated to the mountain air, rippled through the group. David was the first to speak, but his engineering voice was gone, replaced by a strained whisper. "Surface tension? An extreme microscopic hydrophobic surface on the rock?" "David," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "surface tension does not defy gravity, and it certainly doesn't put water back in a bottle." They looked around them, really looked, and that is when they saw the silent warning. They were surrounded by leaves, autumn leaves, bright red and orange. They were covering the ground in a thick carpet, but as they watched, a leaf from the ground beneath Elias's boot detached itself. It did not blow away. It floated straight up, silently, perfectly smoothly, and snapped onto the empty twig of a nearby maple tree. It was followed by another, and another. It was like watching a movie of a forest being reassembled, played in reverse. Chapter 3. No Exit. Now, the natural reaction in this situation for any sane person is to turn around and run, and that is exactly what Elias, Sarah, and David tried to do. "We need to leave." Now, Elias ordered, his voice commanding but laced with a panic they had never heard from him. They grabbed their packs and turned back toward the slope they had just descended. They began to hike up, retracing their steps, but this is where the forest's logic broke them completely. They hiked for 20 minutes, their breath ragged, pushing themselves hard. The slope should have been easy for them, but when they stopped to catch their breath, Sarah looked around and gasped. "We haven't moved," she whispered. They were still standing right next to the flat rock where they had spilled the water. The same pile of reverse gravity leaves was still gathering. "That is impossible," David snapped. "We were just climbing. I felt the incline. I felt the burn in my calves." "Look at the ground," Elias said. They looked down at the soft dirt of the trail they had made on their way in. They saw their own footprints, clear and distinct. But as they watched, the edges of the oldest footprints began to dissolve. The dirt didn't crumble. It gathered itself back up, smoothing out, filling the impression until the ground was unblemished, as if no one had ever walked there. The forest was erasing them. Or rather, it was unwriting their arrival. Panic, real and suffocating, set in. They tried again. This time, they ran. They bolted toward the slope, sprinting up the incline. They pushed themselves until their lungs burned and their hearts hammered against their ribs. They must have covered at least a quarter mile. And then they stopped. And they were back at the flat rock. It did not matter which direction they went or how fast they traveled. The forest had collapsed space-time around them into a loop, and the loop was running in reverse. They were trapped in a bubble where the future was behind them and the past was the only path forward. As the sun impossibly began to set in the west, meaning it was now moving backward towards the east, the light in the valley took on an eerie violet hue. The colors of the spring, like flowers, intensified, vibrating with an unsettling energy. They realized they had to change strategy. They could not outrun time. "We need to think," Sarah said, fighting back tears. "This is Jedediah's valley. His diary said he got younger. It didn't say he died." "He also said he was terrified," Elias reminded her. They huddled together on the flat rock, their only point of stable reality. David was aggressively clicking the buttons on his defunct equipment. Come on, work!" Chapter 4. The Assembly. As night did not fall because the day was retreating toward the morning, they witnessed the most impossible sight yet. Sarah had been referencing the notes she took from the diary, looking for clues. The diary mentioned a hunter's cabin that built itself from the ground up. They had assumed this was a metaphorical description of nature reclaiming a structure. They were wrong. Further up the valley floor, in the middle of a small clearing, there was a pile of rotted, moss-covered logs and a heap of rusted metal. It was clearly the remains of an ancient, collapsed cabin. But as they watched, the logs began to tremble. One log, heavy and decaying, slowly rolled away from the pile. It seemed to lose its moss as it moved. The rot simply vanished, the wood turning from a crumbly gray to a solid, healthy tan. It stood upright. Another log joined it, and another. They watched, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the spectacle, as the cabin began to undecay. The rust dissolved from the metal sheets until they shone like new silver. The logs became smooth and brown again. They lifted themselves into the air and fitted together into a perfect notch. The metal sheets rose and attached themselves to the roof. Glass shards from the ground floated up and reassembled themselves into a perfect, unshattered window pane. In less than 2 hours, a pristine, brand new prospector's cabin stood in the clearing. It looked like it had been built that very day. It was perfect. It was a testament to a time before Jedediah Smith or anyone else had even conceived of entering this valley. Chapter 5. The Return. This cabin was not just a miracle, it was a map. Elias stood up. He looked younger than he had this morning. The gray in his beard was almost gone. The deep lines around his eyes had softened. His skin was tighter. Sarah looked down at her hands and saw the wrinkles of age smoothing away before her eyes. David's face, usually set in a skeptical frown, looked smooth and unblemished, like he was back in his college years. They were all regressing. "We are not trapped in a loop," Elias said, his voice stronger, smoother than before. "We are trapped in a single flow. The forest isn't keeping us here. It is undoing us. And it is moving us toward the moment before we arrived." He looked toward the valley exit, the direction they had come from. "When we tried to run up the hill, we were fighting the flow. We were trying to move forward in time out of the valley while the forest was pushing us backward toward the center." "So, what do we do?" David asked. He sounded like a teenager, his voice cracking. Elias looked at the creek that was now flowing back toward the slope. "We do not hike out," he said. "We swim back." This made no logical sense. To swim backward in a reverse-flowing creek to escape a place that was unwriting their existence. But Elias was right. Logic had no home here. They had to follow the backward flow to the moment before they entered the anomaly. They left their heavy packs on the rock, packs that were now looking newer than when they bought them. They kept only the bare essentials. They walked to the pristine cabin and pushed open the door. Inside, it was spotlessly clean. On the single, unblemished table lay a leather-bound book. It was Jedediah's diary. But it was blank. The forest had completely erased his story, and it was starting on theirs. Elias led them to the bend in the creek. The water was now flowing with significant force back toward the upper valley slope. "We go now," Elias said, looking at his friends. They weren't in their 40s and 50s anymore. They looked like they were in their late 20s. Healthy, strong, but terrified. They stepped into the icy water. It was a fight. But they weren't swimming upstream in the normal sense. They were swimming upstream against the flow of time. They had to actively push themselves backward relative to the water's current. It was an endurance test unlike any other. They pulled themselves over rocks, fought against the reverse current, their bodies burning from the exertion of unmovement. They were regressing further. They felt younger, less experienced, their minds clouding slightly with the memories of their youth. If they stopped, even for a moment, the forest would unwrite their effort and wash them back to the center of the loop, where they would continue to regress until they were infants, and then nothingness. Chapter 6, The Toll. They do not know how long they fought that reverse current. Hours? Days? Time had no meaning. Finally, just as Sarah felt her mind regressing into childhood, her memories of cartography dissolving into simple shapes and colors, they reached the steep incline that led out of the bowl. They scrambled out of the water and onto the slope, and they ran. Not forward, but backward. They ran backward up the slope, retracing the erased footprints of their arrival, and then, suddenly, they hit a wall. It was not a physical wall. It was an atmospheric one. The oppressive silence snapped. A bird chirped. The air suddenly felt autumn crisp, not spring warm. They fell to the ground on the ridgeline, gasping for air. The violet light was gone, replaced by the orange glow of a proper sunset setting in the east. They had crossed the threshold. They were back in the forward-flowing world. But they were not the same. Elias looked at his hands. They were covered in veins and liver spots. His beard was pure, snowy white. His joints ached with an arthritis he had never had before. He was not in his late 40s. He was in his 70s. Sarah pulled a small mirror from her pocket. She looked at her reflection. Deep lines etched her face. Her hair was completely gray. She was also an elderly woman. And David, the engineer, the skeptic. He was a frail old man, his hands shaking as he stared at the ground. The forest had not just unwritten their arrival. To pay for their escape, to pay for their backward travel out of the valley, the universe had demanded a price. It had taken all the forward-flowing years they had spent in their lives and subtracted them. They had been made younger in the valley, but the act of leaving required them to travel forward through those same years at an accelerated, impossible rate. They had lived 40 years of life in the space of a single day. They gathered what little strength they had left. They were now in an impossible situation, elderly, weak, and stranded in the deep wilderness with no supplies. Their only chance was to make it to the trailhead where David's truck was parked. It was a hike they could have done in a day before. Now, it was a multi-day ordeal that tested every ounce of their remaining will. They had to help each other walk. David, the once strong engineer, had to be supported by Elias. Sarah, the navigator, kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, fighting the urge to surrender to exhaustion. By some miracle, or perhaps the forest showing a final, cruel mercy, they made it to the trailhead. They collapsed next to David's truck, unable to open the doors. Luckily, a passing forestry service patrol found them hours later. Conclusion. When they were questioned by the park rangers and the sheriff, their story, of course, was not believed. Old people with dementia wandering in the woods. That was the official verdict. Elias's beard was gray again after a few weeks, but the wrinkles remained. Sarah and David also found that their accelerated aging was permanent. Their bodies had carried the toll of their journey. But the most terrifying part was not the physical change. Years later, Sarah was sorting through her belongings when she found her notes from Jedediah's diary again. She had left the original on the ridge, but the rangers had recovered her field journal. She opened it, expecting to see her sketches of the valley. But the pages had changed. The final entry was written in fresh ink in a script that was strong and distinct. It was Sarah's own handwriting, but from a time she didn't remember writing it. It said, "We are not the only ones. The valley has been empty before, and it will be empty again. It waits. And when it receives you, it will show you everything you have ever lost by unliving everything you have ever achieved." And just beneath it, in Elias's bold block letters, was the silent warning that the forest had always carried. Do not enter. Time is not a river here. It is a maelstrom, and it never lets you go the same way you came in. And the most chilling thought is this: did they actually escape? Or are they right now in their elderly, broken bodies simply living out a simulation created by the forest, a simulation that will run all the way back to the moment they decided to seek the truth, only for them to make the same choice again? That is the mystery of the forest, where time runs backward. If you like strange, dark, and mysterious stories, please hit that like button and then unexpectedly pull away right before contact. Until next time. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because today we are going to look at a case that sits at the very edge of what we consider possible. It is a story that involves a man, a car, and a stretch of highway that for 3 minutes decided that the laws of physics simply did not apply. To understand the sheer impossibility of what happened, you first have to understand the man it happened to. Arthur Miller was 55 years old, a civil engineer who lived his life by the slide rule and the level. He was not a man of whimsy. He did not believe in ghosts, he did not read horoscopes, and he certainly did not believe in glitches in the Matrix. Arthur was the kind of person who measured the pressure in his tires every single morning before heading to the office, and he kept a detailed log of his fuel mileage in a small leather-bound notebook in his glove compartment. For Arthur, the world was a series of equations, and if something did not add up, it was simply because you had not found the right formula yet. It was a cool Tuesday evening in October of 2024. Arthur had been in Albuquerque, New Mexico, finalizing a bridge inspection for a private firm. He was a man who preferred his own bed to any hotel room, no matter how many stars it had or how soft the pillows were. He missed his wife, he missed his quiet home in the suburbs of Houston, and he missed the predictable humidity of the Texas Gulf Coast. So at exactly 11 o'clock at night, Arthur climbed into his silver 2018 sedan. He checked his mirrors, he adjusted his seat, he checked his fuel gauge, which sat at exactly 3/4 of a tank. He had a long night ahead of him. From his location in Albuquerque to his front door in Houston, Texas, the distance is roughly 880 miles. Even with a heavy foot and no traffic, that is a 14-hour drive. Most people would have stayed the night and left at sunrise, but Arthur liked the solitude of the midnight road. He liked the way the world felt like it belonged only to him when the sun was on the other side of the planet. Arthur grabbed a large black coffee from a Shell gas station on the edge of the city. He didn't even want cream or sugar, just the bitter heat to keep his mind sharp. The receipt from that gas station, which would later become a crucial piece of evidence, was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. He tucked it into his center console, not knowing that this small slip of thermal paper would soon become one of the most debated documents in the history of the Department of Transportation. As he pulled onto the interstate, the desert was a vast obsidian sea. The moon was a thin sliver providing almost no light. It was just Arthur, the hum of his tires, and the glowing green numbers on his dashboard clock. He settled into the cruise control at 75 miles per hour. He put on a podcast about the history of the Roman Empire and prepared for the long trek through the darkness. At exactly 12 o'clock midnight, Arthur was passing through the outskirts of Santa Rosa, New Mexico. He remembered looking at the clock because he liked to track his progress in 1-hour increments. He was making good time. The desert air was crisp and the visibility was perfect. There were no other cars on the road, not a single pair of headlights in his rearview mirror, and no one coming the other way. It was that specific kind of silence you only find in the American Southwest, a silence so heavy it almost feels like a physical weight against your ears. Suddenly, Arthur noticed something strange about the air in front of him. About 500 yards ahead, the pitch-black darkness of the highway seemed to ripple. It wasn't a fog, and it wasn't smoke. He described it later as looking like the heat haze that rises off asphalt on a July afternoon, but it was midnight and the temperature was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The stars above that section of the road seemed to wobble and distort like he was looking at them through a glass of water. He expected to drive through it in a second. He gripped the steering wheel, thinking it might be a localized dust storm or some strange atmospheric phenomenon common to the high plains. He didn't slow down. In his mind, there was no reason to. It was just air. As his headlights hit the ripple, the world didn't just change, it vanished. For what felt like a heartbeat, Arthur experienced a sensation of total weightlessness. The sound of the engine, which had been a steady, comforting roar, silenced instantly. It wasn't that the engine had died, it was as if the concept of sound had been erased from the universe. He couldn't feel the vibration of the steering wheel, he couldn't feel the seat beneath him, he couldn't see the road. He couldn't see the stars. He was encased in a thick, pearlescent gray light that seemed to vibrate. It wasn't a color he had ever seen before, it was more like the absence of all other colors. He felt a pressure in his inner ear, the kind you get when a plane descends too quickly, but intensified 100 times over. He tried to scream, but he couldn't tell if he was making a sound. His vision began to tunnel, and a strange smell filled the cabin like ozone and old parchment. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the world slammed back into existence. Arthur's tires barked as they gripped the pavement. His car jolted, swaying slightly as if it had been dropped from a height of 6 inches. The roar of the wind and the engine returned with a vengeance. The Roman History podcast was still playing, but the narrator's voice sounded distorted for a split second before snapping back to normal. Arthur slammed on his brakes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled over onto the shoulder, his hands shaking so violently he could barely shift the car into park. He sat there for a long moment, gasping for air, staring at the dashboard. He thought he might have had a stroke. He thought perhaps the coffee had been spiked or he had fallen asleep at the wheel and was having a vivid nightmare. He looked at the digital clock on his dash. It was 12:03 a.m. Only 3 minutes had passed since he was in Santa Rosa, New Mexico. He looked out the window, expecting to see the red mesas and sagebrush of the high desert, but he didn't see the desert. He saw bright white LED streetlights. He saw a massive green highway sign with white lettering hanging over the road. The sign read, "Exit 610 Westheimer Road." Arthur's breath hitched. Westheimer Road. That was his exit. But Westheimer Road wasn't in New Mexico. It was in the heart of Houston, Texas. He looked around in a daze. To his left, the silhouette of the Williams Tower pierced the humid night sky. The air outside wasn't 42 degrees and dry, it was 75 degrees and thick with Texas humidity. He could smell the familiar scent of the Gulf, the damp earth, and the exhaust of a city that never truly sleeps. Arthur sat in his car, paralyzed. He checked his GPS. The blue dot pulsed steadily on the screen, centered directly on the west loop of Interstate 610 in Houston. He zoomed out. The map showed him over 800 miles away from where he had been 3 minutes ago. He checked the trip odometer. When he had left the gas station in Albuquerque, he had reset it to 0.0. It should have read nearly 900 miles by the time he reached this point. The odometer read 0.6 miles. Arthur drove the remaining 2 miles to his house in a state of total shock. He didn't even remember turning onto a street. He pulled into his driveway, parked the car, and just sat there. He didn't turn off the engine. He didn't turn off the lights. He just stared at the fuel gauge. When he had left Albuquerque, the tank was 3/4 full. After a drive that should have consumed nearly 2 full tanks of gasoline and necessitated at least 1 stop for fuel, the needle had not moved a millimeter. It was still at exactly 3/4. The next morning, Arthur didn't go to work. He didn't call his boss. He went to the local police station in the Harris County district. He didn't know what else to do. He was an engineer and his world had just broken. He thought he was having a psychotic break or that he was the victim of some elaborate high-tech prank. "I think I stole time," he told the officer at the front desk. The police naturally thought he was drunk or suffering from early onset dementia. They asked him if he knew what year it was and who the president was. Arthur answered every question correctly with the cold precision of a scientist. He showed them his car. He showed them the lack of wear on his tires. But then they started looking at the physical evidence and the joking stopped. First, they found the receipt in his cup holder. A paper receipt from a Shell station in Albuquerque, New Mexico, dated Tuesday night, October 24th, 2024, timestamped at 11:47 p.m. Next, they checked the highway toll records. Arthur's car was equipped with an electronic easy tag for the Texas toll roads. At 12:04 a.m., just 7 minutes after he bought that coffee in New Mexico, and only 4 minutes after he had been in Santa Rosa, his toll tag had been scanned by a high-speed camera on the Sam Houston Tollway in Houston. The distance between those 2 points is approximately 882 miles. To cover that distance in 7 minutes, Arthur's sedan would have had to be traveling at over 7,500 miles per hour. That is nearly 10 times the speed of sound. A standard commercial sedan would have disintegrated into a ball of plasma long before it reached a fraction of that speed. The sonic boom alone would have leveled every building in Santa Rosa. The authorities were baffled. They brought in experts from the Department of Defense and physicists from local universities. They checked the car's onboard computer, the black box. The computer confirmed that the engine had been running for less than 10 minutes total since the last start command in Albuquerque. There was no evidence of tampering. No one had hacked the GPS. No one had altered the time. The car simply believed it had only traveled a few thousand yards. But it was the watch that truly defied logic. Arthur wore a high-end mechanical wristwatch, a Patek Philippe, that he had treated himself to for his 50th birthday. It was the kind of watch that doesn't rely on batteries or satellites or quartz crystals. It relies on the physical movement of gears and a swinging weight. It is a masterpiece of Newtonian physics. When the investigators compared Arthur's watch to the official atomic time held by the government, they found something that made the lead investigator go pale. Arthur's watch was exactly 14 hours behind. To the mechanical gears of that watch, 14 hours of time had passed. But to the world outside the car, only 3 minutes had passed. It was as if, for Arthur and everything inside the car, 14 hours of being had happened in the span of 3 minutes. But the car hadn't used gas, the tires hadn't worn down, the oil was still clean, the coffee in his cup was still piping hot. If 14 hours had passed for the coffee, it should have been ice cold. One physicist from Rice University proposed a theory of a localized wormhole, a fold in the fabric of space-time that Arthur had accidentally driven through. He suggested that the car didn't travel through space at all, but rather space moved around the car, but that didn't explain the watch. If the car hadn't moved through time, why was the watch 14 hours slow? Another theory was even stranger. Some suggested that Arthur had entered a higher dimension where distance is irrelevant and then re-entered our world at the destination he was thinking about. Because he was so focused on getting home, his mind, or the car's intent, had anchored him to the Houston exit. The story was eventually suppressed. The official report issued months later claimed a clerical error in the timestamping of the toll cameras and a synchronization failure with the gas station's point-of-sale system. They told Arthur it was a 1 in a million technical glitch. They told him to go home and forget about it. They even offered to buy the car from him for 3 times its market value. Arthur refused to sell the car. He kept it in his garage under a heavy tarp. He never drove it again. But Arthur knew the truth. He remembered the gray light. He remembered the feeling of the universe folding in on itself like a piece of paper being tucked into an envelope. He remembered the silence that was louder than any noise he had ever heard. To this day, Arthur Miller does not drive on the interstate at night. He stays in well-lit areas. He retired early and sold his house in Houston, moving to a small town where he can walk to the grocery store, because he realized that the world we live in, the one with rules and maps and clocks, is just a thin veneer. It is a fragile layer of logic that we use to keep the chaos at bay. And sometimes, for reasons we will never understand, that veneer peels back. Sometimes the road doesn't go where it is supposed to go. He was a man who lived by the slide rule, but now he knows that there are some distances that cannot be measured and some journeys that defy every logic we hold dear. He knows that somewhere out there in the dark stretches of the American desert, the highway is waiting to fold again. And that is a story for the strange, dark, and mysterious. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do here. Today, we are going to look at a case that defies every known law of physics and telecommunications. It is a story that has left seasoned investigators and electrical engineers scratching their heads for decades. But before we get into that, if you could please gently recount the number of times you have misplaced your keys and then ask the like button to find them for you, only to have the like button lead you directly into a walk-in closet and lock the door from the outside, that would be great. The Pacific Northwest is a place known for its towering Douglas firs, its perpetual gray mist, and a silence that feels heavy, almost as if the forest itself is holding its breath. In the late autumn of 1998, a man named Arthur Penhaligon was driving his old 1985 Ford truck down a winding logging road near the border of Washington and Oregon. Arthur was 62 years old, a retired electrician who enjoyed the solitude of the mountains. He was a man of logic. He understood how things worked. He understood circuits, currents, and the way power moved from point A to point B. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or ghost stories. He was the kind of man who carried a multimeter in his glove box and believed that every problem had a mechanical solution. On this particular evening, the sun had dipped below the jagged horizon at approximately 5:45 in the afternoon. The temperature began to plummet, dropping from a crisp 45 degrees down to a bone-chilling 32 within an hour. Arthur was headed to his remote cabin to winterize the pipes before the first heavy snow of the season arrived. The air smelled of damp pine and wet earth, and the only sound was the steady rumble of his engine. About 20 miles past the last gas station, a small, dilapidated building with a flickering neon sign, Arthur's truck began to sputter. He watched the needle on his fuel gauge dance erratically before it plummeted to empty. This was impossible. He had filled the tank in the town of Morton just an hour prior. He had checked the cap himself. There was no leak, no smell of gasoline, just a sudden and absolute absence of fuel. Then the headlights flickered once, twice, and died. The dashboard lights followed, fading into a dull amber before vanishing. The engine gave one final pathetic gasp and fell silent. Arthur was coasting in total darkness. He managed to steer the heavy vehicle onto the narrow shoulder, the tires crunching over wet gravel and pine needles until the truck came to a complete halt. He sat there for a moment in the absolute silence of the woods. He tried the ignition, nothing. Not even the click of a starter. The entire electrical system of the truck was fried. It was as if every electron in the vehicle had simply decided to stop moving. Arthur reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his cell phone. Now, you have to remember, in 1998, cell phones were not the sleek glass rectangles we have today. This was a heavy, gray Motorola brick phone. It was rugged, it was clunky, and it was notoriously power-hungry. It was the kind of device that felt more like a weapon than a communication tool. Arthur looked at the screen. It was dead. He remembered clearly that he had forgotten to plug it into the cigarette lighter during his drive, and the battery had been at 5% when he left Morton. Now, after an hour of searching for a signal in the mountains, the battery was completely drained. He pressed the power button, nothing. He held it down for 10 seconds, still nothing. Being an electrician, Arthur did what he always did when a device failed. He removed the battery casing from the back of the phone to check the copper contact points. He slid the heavy nickel-cadmium battery pack off the chassis of the phone and set it on the passenger seat. He looked at the phone in his left hand, a hollow plastic shell with no power source, and the battery in his right. The contacts looked clean, but it did not matter. The battery was dead anyway. He placed the battery pack into the glove box, thinking he would deal with it in the morning, and he tucked the disconnected battery-less phone into the center console. Arthur decided to stay with the truck. It was too dark and too cold to hike 20 miles back to the main road. He wrapped himself in a heavy wool blanket he kept behind the seat and settled in for a long, freezing night. At approximately 11:42 that night, in a dimly lit emergency dispatch center in the county seat, a woman named Sarah was working the graveyard shift. Sarah had been a 911 operator for 15 years. She had heard it all: prank calls, tragic accidents, and the panicked breathing of people facing their final moments. She was a professional, steady and calm under pressure. The room was quiet, filled only with the low hum of computer cooling fans and the occasional murmur of other dispatchers. Suddenly, Sarah's console lit up, an incoming emergency call. She put on her headset and pressed the accept button. 911. "What is the location of your emergency?" she asked, her voice calm and practiced. There was nothing but static on the other end. But it was not the usual white noise of a bad connection. It sounded like wind, a howling, whistling wind that seemed to be blowing directly into the microphone. It had a hollow, metallic quality to it. "Hello? This is 911 dispatch. Can you hear me?" Through the static, a voice finally broke through. It was faint, distorted, and sounded as if it were coming from the bottom of a very deep well. It was a man's voice, but it lacked the natural cadence of human speech. "Help, cold, broken down. Mile marker 42, National Forest Road." The voice was thin and raspy. Sarah checked her screen for the caller ID information. In 1998, Enhanced 911 was still in its infancy, but the system was supposed to show the phone number and, if it was a landline, the address. For cell phones, it usually just showed the nearest tower. But Sarah's screen was flickering. The field for incoming number was filled with zeros. The location field was blinking rapidly, displaying coordinates that the computer could not seem to lock onto. The system was struggling, as if the signal itself was too powerful for the hardware to process. "Sir, I need you to stay on the line," Sarah said, signaling to her supervisor. "I have your location near mile marker 42. We are sending a state trooper to your position. Can you tell me your name?" The voice on the other end did not answer the question. Instead, it whispered something that chilled Sarah to her core. "The battery. There is no battery." Then, the line went dead. Back on the logging road, Arthur Penhaligon was jolted awake. It was not the cold that woke him, though his breath was visible in the cabin of the truck as a thick white vapor. It was a sound, a high-pitched, rhythmic chirping. Arthur sat up, disoriented. He looked around the dark cab. The sound was coming from the center console. It was the Motorola. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the phone. He felt the cold plastic against his palm. He turned it over. The back of the phone was still open. The battery compartment was completely empty. He could see the silver springs and the copper pins exposed to the air. There was nothing connecting the phone to any power source. Yet, the screen was glowing. It was not the dull green glow typical of those early liquid crystal displays. It was a bright, searing neon blue, a color that the phone was not even capable of producing with its standard hardware. And on the screen, in perfectly formed black digits, were the numbers 911. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the cold. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello?" he whispered. He did not hear Sarah. He did not hear a dispatcher. He heard his own voice, but it was coming from the earpiece. "Help. Cold. Broken down. Mile marker 42. It was a recording of what he had just said, except Arthur had been dead asleep. He had not made a call. He watched, mesmerized and terrified, as the phone, with no battery, no power source, and no physical way to transmit a signal, continued to glow in his hand. He dropped the phone onto the floorboards as if it had burned him. It landed face up, the blue light illuminating the interior of the truck like a strobe light. Then the phone began to speak to him. Not in a human voice, but in a series of electronic tones that sounded like a modem trying to connect to a server. The sounds were rhythmic, pulsing, and they seemed to vibrate the very metal of the truck. Arthur scrambled to the passenger side, reaching for the door handle. He needed to get out. He did not care about the cold or the wolves or the 20-mile hike. He just needed to be away from that device. He shoved the door open and tumbled out into the snow. He did not stop running until he was 50 yards away, hidden behind the thick trunk of an ancient cedar tree. He watched his truck from a distance. The blue light was pulsing inside the cab, growing brighter and brighter until the entire vehicle looked like a glowing ember in the middle of the pitch-black forest. The light was so intense it cast long, dancing shadows of the trees against the snow. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. The forest returned to its heavy, oppressive silence. 2 hours later, State Trooper Miller was driving his cruiser up National Forest Road. He had received the dispatch about a stranded motorist at mile marker 42. He was skeptical. That area was a notorious dead zone for radio and cellular communication. There was not a tower for 30 miles. As he rounded a sharp bend, his spotlights caught the glint of chrome. He saw the 1985 Ford truck sitting on the shoulder. Trooper Miller pulled up behind it, leaving his overhead lights flashing red and blue against the trees. He stepped out of his car, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. He approached the driver's side window with his flashlight drawn. The truck was empty. The driver's side door was closed, but the passenger side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Miller shined his light inside. He saw a wool blanket crumpled on the floor. He saw a set of keys in the ignition. And then he saw the phone. It was lying on the floorboards on the driver's side. Miller picked it up. He was a tech-savvy guy for the late 90s, and he immediately noticed something wrong. He turned the phone over. "Where is the battery?" he muttered to himself. He looked around the cab and spotted the battery pack sitting inside the open glove box. He picked it up and tried to snap it onto the back of the phone. It would not fit. The plastic casing of the phone had been warped, melted from the inside out, as if it had been subjected to an intense, localized heat source that had bubbled the polymer. "Dispatch, this is Miller," he said into his shoulder mic. "I have located the vehicle. It is abandoned. But I have got something weird here." The reporting caller: "You said he called from a cell phone?" "That is affirmative, Miller." Sarah's voice came back, sounding exhausted. The system logged it as a mobile call, but the ID was all zeros. "Well," Miller said, looking at the melted plastic in his hand, "that is impossible. This phone does not have a battery in it, and even if it did, the guts of this thing are fused together. There is no way this made a call tonight, or ever again." Arthur Penhaligon was found the next morning 3 miles away, wandering in a state of advanced hypothermia. He was incoherent, mumbling about the blue light and the voice in the machine. When he finally recovered in a hospital in Vancouver, Washington, investigators questioned him about the call. Arthur told them exactly what happened. He told them he had removed the battery. He told them he had been asleep. He told them the phone had called 911 on its own, using his own voice, before he had even spoken. The authorities, of course, did not believe him. They chalked it up to paradoxical undressing and hallucinations brought on by the extreme cold. They assumed he had made the call in a state of delirium, perhaps forgetting that he had put the battery in and then taken it out again. But there were three things they could not explain. First, the phone's internal components had been subjected to a burst of electromagnetic energy so powerful that the copper wiring had transitioned into a state of plasma before solidifying again. There was no source of such energy anywhere in the forest, and certainly nothing that wouldn't have killed Arthur instantly if he were holding it. Second, the recording of the 911 call was analyzed by sound engineers. They found that the voice identifying itself as Arthur Penhaligon did not match the frequency of Arthur's actual vocal cords. It was a perfect digital synthesis, a recreation of his voice that was too perfect, lacking the natural micro tremors of a human being under stress. And third, the time of the call. Sarah at dispatch had recorded the call at 11:42 p.m. However, when the state trooper examined Arthur's truck, he found the analog clock on the dashboard had stopped. It had not stopped because the battery died. It had stopped because the metal gears inside the clock had been fused together. The time on the dashboard clock? 11:42. But according to Arthur's wristwatch, which was still ticking when he was found, he had been standing behind that cedar tree watching the blue light for what felt like hours before the trooper arrived. Time, it seemed, had behaved differently inside that truck. The most disturbing piece of evidence came months later. A technician at the Motorola Service Center was tasked with trying to extract any data from the melted brick phone. He managed to bypass the fried motherboard and tap directly into the memory chip, which had miraculously survived the heat. There was only one outgoing call logged in the internal memory. It was not to 911. The number logged was a string of 24 digits that did not correspond to any known country code or telephone system on Earth. When the technician ran the number through a frequency analyzer, it translated into a set of coordinates. They were not coordinates on a map. They were star coordinates for a sector of the Botez Void, a region of space billions of light years away that is known to astronomers as the Great Nothing, a place where there are almost no galaxies, no stars, and no light. To this day, the 911 call from nowhere remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of the Washington State Patrol. Arthur Penhaligon never went back into the woods. He sold his cabin and moved to the desert of Arizona, where the sky is clear and the silence is different. Because Arthur knew something the investigators did not want to admit. He knew that on that cold November night, the phone did not need a battery. It did not need a tower. It was not looking for a signal from Earth. It was a beacon. And something, somewhere in the Great Nothing, had finally picked up the line. If you found this story as unsettling as I did, please be sure to check out our other accounts of the Unexplained. Would you like me to look into more cases where technology seems to take on a life of its own? Or perhaps you would like to hear about the mysterious disappearances in the high mountains? Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because today, we are going to look at a case that has left historians, scientists, and photographic experts completely baffled for decades. This is a story that does not just push the boundaries of what we know about technology, it completely shatters the timeline of human history as we understand it. The discovery in the dust. The story begins in the autumn of 1994 in a small, quiet town just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Our main character is a man named Thomas Miller. Now, Thomas was a retired high school history teacher in his late 60s. He was the kind of guy who spent his weekends browsing through estate sales, looking for old books, discarded journals, or any little piece of the past he could rescue from a dumpster. He had this philosophy that history was not just in textbooks, it was in the objects people left behind. One Saturday afternoon, Thomas found himself at a particularly dilapidated Victorian home. The owner had passed away, leaving behind a mountain of clutter that spanned generations. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and history. Thomas made his way up to the attic, a place that smelled of mothballs and damp cedar. It was a cramped space filled with cardboard boxes and furniture covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. In the far corner, buried under a moth-eaten wool blanket, he found a small, iron-bound wooden chest. It was heavy, and the wood felt dense and ancient. He bought the chest for $20, took it home, and set it on his workbench in the garage. When he finally pried the rusted lock open, he did not find gold or jewelry. Instead, he found a stack of letters tied with twine, and at the very bottom, a heavy velvet-lined case. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was a daguerreotype case, the kind used for the very first types of photographs. Now, for those of you who do not know, the daguerreotype was the first publicly available photographic process, and it did not even hit the scene until 1839. Before that, if you wanted a likeness of someone, you had to hire a painter. There was no such thing as clicking a picture. With shaking hands, Thomas clicked the small brass latch and opened the case. Inside was a silver-plated copper sheet, and as he tilted it toward the light, a ghostly image shimmered into view. But as Thomas looked closer, the blood drained from his face. The image that should not exist. The photograph was a portrait of a man sitting in a high-backed wooden chair. He was dressed in a formal coat with wide lapels and a cravat tied meticulously at his neck. His hair was powdered and pulled back in a style that screamed the late 18th century. But it was not just the clothes. Thomas was a history buff. He knew his eras. He looked at the background. Behind the man was a window, and through that window, you could clearly see a specific landmark, the Old North Church in Boston, but it looked different. It had a wooden spire that Thomas knew for a fact had been destroyed in a massive gale in the year 1804. It was never rebuilt in that exact style. Thomas grabbed a magnifying glass. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned the metal plate over. Tucked into the back of the frame was a tiny yellowed scrap of parchment. On it, written in elegant, looping cursive with a fountain pen, were 4 words that defied all logic. October 1798. Thomas sat back, the air in his garage feeling suddenly very cold. If that date was correct, this photograph was taken 41 years before the invention of the camera. It was taken before Louis Daguerre ever dreamed of capturing light on silver. It was taken when George Washington was still alive. It was quite simply impossible. The investigation begins. Thomas could not sleep. He spent the entire night staring at that silver plate. He thought maybe it was a clever hoax, a modern recreation made to look old. But he had handled enough 19th century artifacts to know the feel of genuine age, the patina on the copper, the specific way the silver had oxidized at the edges. It looked over 200 years old. The next Monday, Thomas took the plate to a friend of his, Dr. Harrison Thorne, a professor of archival sciences at a prestigious university in Cambridge. Thorne was a skeptic by nature, the kind of man who believed everything had a rational, boring explanation. Thomas laid the photo on the professor's desk without saying a word. Thorne put on his spectacles, leaned in, and hummed. "Beautiful daguerreotype, Thomas," Thorne said. "Early 1840s, I assume? The clarity is remarkable for such an early specimen." Thomas leaned forward. "Look at the window, Harrison. Look at the church spire. And then look at the note inside the casing." Thorne opened the back, read the parchment, and laughed. 1798? Well, someone had a sense of humor back then. It is a clerical error, or perhaps a descendant misremembered the date of their ancestor's portrait. But the spire, Thomas persisted, that spire has not existed since the Great Gale of 1804. If this was taken in 1839, they would have had to travel back in time to get that background. Thorne's smile faded. He took the plate to a high-powered microscope. He spent 3 hours performing a non-destructive chemical analysis of the surface. As he worked, his movements became slower, more deliberate. His face turned a shade of gray that matched the silver plate. "Thomas," Thorne whispered, not taking his eyes off the lens. "This is not a modern fake. The chemical composition of the light-sensitive halides, it is primitive. In fact, it is more primitive than what Daguerre used. But there is something else. The silver is not just coated, it is bonded in a way that we do not see in 19th century photography. He looked up, his eyes wide behind his glasses. According to the physical degradation of the metal and the way the light has burned into the plate, this image was indeed captured over 2 centuries ago. I do not know how, and I do not know who did it, but this photo was taken when the United States had only 16 states. The man in the mirror. The two men decided to dig deeper. They wanted to know who the man in the photo was. Through a grueling search of Boston's genealogical records and old property maps, they finally found a match. The man in the chair was a man named Silas Endicott. Silas was a brilliant, albeit reclusive, clockmaker and silversmith who lived in a small workshop near the Boston harbor. According to local records, Silas was considered a mad genius by his neighbors. He did not have a family, he did not have apprentices, and he rarely left his shop. But there was a dark legend attached to his name. In late 1798, the exact time written on the note, Silas Endicott vanished. His shop was found locked from the inside. When the authorities finally kicked the door down, they found the place in perfect order. There was no sign of a struggle. His tools were laid out on the bench. A meal was sitting on the table, half-eaten and covered in mold. But Silas was gone. He was never seen again. He became a footnote in local history, a man who simply walked out of existence. Thomas and Thorne realized they were looking at the last known sighting of Silas Endicott, but it was not a witness account, it was a physical record. Silas had somehow captured his own image on a plate of silver and copper 30 years before the world even knew what a camera was. The impossible logic. They took the photograph to a specialized lab in New York that handled the world's most expensive art forgeries. They used a process called X-ray fluorescence to look under the image. What they found sent chills down their spines. Typically, a photograph is a flat representation of a scene. But when they mapped the light particles on Silas Endicott's plate, they found that the image had a depth that should not be possible. It was not just a capture of light hitting a surface. It was as if the person in the photo was etched into the very molecular structure of the metal. One of the technicians, a young woman who worked with cutting-edge optics, pulled Thomas aside. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice trembling, "I have looked at thousands of historical photos. In every single one, there is a grain, a limit to the detail. But with this one, the more I zoom in, the more detail I find. I zoomed in on the man's eye. I can see the reflection of the room behind the camera." Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "And what do you see?" "I see a machine," she said. "It does not look like a camera. It looks like a series of polished mirrors and glass spheres arranged in a circle. And there is someone else in the reflection. A tall figure standing by the machine, wearing clothes that do not look like they belong in 1798 or 1839. The figure in the reflection was wearing a sleek, dark garment that appeared to be made of a single piece of seamless material. No buttons, no lapels, no cravats. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie from the late 20th century. The Vanishing. As the investigation gained momentum, word started to leak out. A few fringe journals began asking questions. Thomas and Thorne were preparing to go public with their findings at a major historical symposium. They believed they had proof of a technological jump, a moment in history where someone or something had introduced advanced technology centuries before its time. But then, the strange part of the strange, dark, and mysterious truly took over. On the night of November 12, 1994, Thomas Miller's house was broken into. But it was not a standard burglary. Nothing of value was taken, his television was there, his wife's jewelry was untouched, and his wallet was sitting right on the kitchen counter. The only thing missing was the wooden chest, the letters, and the silver plate. Thomas called Dr. Thorne immediately, only to find that Thorne's office at the university had been sanitized. Every digital file, every scan, and every chemical report related to the photograph had been wiped from the university servers. The physical notes Thorne had taken were gone. When Thomas went to the police, they treated him like he was losing his mind. There was no record of Silas Endicott in the town's digital archives anymore. It was as if a giant eraser had been rubbed across the face of history. The final mystery. Today, Thomas Miller is in his late 90s. He lives in a quiet, assisted living facility. Most people who hear his story think it is just the ramblings of an old man who watched too many episodes of The Twilight Zone, but Thomas knows what he saw. He remembers the cold weight of that silver plate in his hand. He remembers the haunting, knowing look in Silas Endicott's eyes, a look that seemed to say, "I found a way out." There are those who believe that Silas Endicott did not just invent a camera. They believe he discovered a way to manipulate light and time using the silver and mirrors he worked with every day. They believe the photograph was not a portrait, but a side effect of a glitch in the timeline, a moment where the past and the future collided in a small workshop in Boston. If you ever find yourself in an old attic or at a dusty estate sale and you see a velvet-lined case tucked away in a corner, be careful when you open it. You might just find a face looking back at you from a time that should not exist. And if you do find it, do not tell a soul. Because there are forces out there that want to make sure the impossible stays hidden in the shadows of the past. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do, several times a week. Today's story involves a man named Elias Thorne. Now, Elias was the kind of person many of you might recognize. He was 58 years old, a retired structural engineer from Seattle, Washington. He was a man who lived his life by the laws of physics, by the cold, hard reality of blueprints and load-bearing walls. He didn't believe in the supernatural, he didn't believe in luck, and he certainly didn't believe in ghosts. To Elias, the world was a series of equations that could be solved if you just had enough data. But on a cold Tuesday in October, Elias would find himself standing in the middle of the Olympic National Forest, staring at a piece of evidence that would not only break his understanding of science, but would leave him questioning if he was even alive. The path to the peak. It was roughly 6 o'clock in the morning when Elias pulled his silver SUV into the trailhead parking lot near Mount Eleanor. The air was crisp, hovering somewhere around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun hadn't quite cleared the horizon yet, leaving the forest in a deep navy blue shadow. Elias was an avid hiker. He had been hiking these trails for over 30 years. He knew the routes, he knew the switchbacks, and he knew the behavior of the mountain goats that frequented the higher elevations. This was his sanctuary. Since his wife had passed away 3 years prior, the silence of the woods was the only thing that brought him any real peace. On this particular morning, Elias was carrying a high-end digital camera with a heavy tripod strapped to his pack. He had recently taken up landscape photography as a way to fill the quiet hours of his retirement. His goal for the day was to reach a specific outcropping, a jagged ledge that overlooked the valley just as the morning fog began to burn off. He started his ascent. For the first 2 hours, everything was perfectly normal. He passed a few other hikers coming down, people who had likely camped near the summit, but by the time he reached the 4,000-foot mark, he was completely alone. The higher he climbed, the thicker the mist became. It wasn't just a fog. It was one of those heavy Pacific Northwest mists that seems to swallow sound. Elias reached the ledge at approximately 9:15 in the morning. He was winded, his lungs burning slightly from the cold air, but the view was spectacular. Below him, a sea of white clouds tumbled over the evergreen treetops. It looked like a frozen ocean. He set up his tripod, he was meticulous, leveling the legs on the uneven basalt rock. He adjusted his settings, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, all the technical details he loved because they were predictable. After taking several landscape shots, Elias decided he wanted to be in the frame. He wanted a photo to show his daughter, something to prove he was still out there, still active, still conquering the mountains. He set the camera's self-timer for 30 seconds. He pressed the shutter button, and the small red light began to blink. 1 flash per second. Elias turned and walked about 20 feet away, positioning himself at the very edge of the cliff. He turned his back to the camera, looking out over the abyss, hands tucked into the pockets of his heavy, charcoal gray fleece jacket. Click. The shutter fired. Elias walked back to the camera, checked the digital display, and saw a perfectly framed shot of himself looking out into the mist. He felt a sense of satisfaction. He packed up his gear, drank the last of his coffee from a thermos, and began the long trek back down the mountain. The shadow in the frame. Elias arrived home late that afternoon. He followed his usual routine. He kicked off his muddy boots in the mudroom, started a fire in the hearth, and sat down at his desk with a glass of scotch. He popped the memory card from his camera into his computer. He began scrolling through the images. The landscapes were beautiful, vivid greens and deep grays. Then he reached the final photo, the self-portrait. Elias took a sip of his drink and squinted at the screen. At first, he thought there was a smudge on the lens. There was a blurry shape in the background, about 15 feet behind where he had been standing. He used his mouse to zoom in, thinking it might be one of those mountain goats or perhaps another hiker who had wandered into the shot at the last second. But as the pixels sharpened, Elias felt a cold sensation wash over his neck. It wasn't a goat, it was a person. The figure was standing near a cluster of hemlock trees. It was slightly translucent, as if it were made of smoke, but the details were clear enough to make out. The person was wearing a charcoal gray fleece jacket. They had a black backpack with a distinctive neon green rain cover tucked into the side pocket. They were wearing a faded blue baseball cap with a Seattle Mariners logo on the front. Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He looked down at his own clothes, which were currently draped over the chair next to him. He looked at his backpack on the floor. He looked at his hat on the desk. The figure in the photo was wearing his exact outfit. Not just a similar one, the exact one. There was a specific tear on the left sleeve of the fleece that Elias had gotten from a thorn bush 2 years prior. The figure in the photo had that same tear. But here was the part that made Elias's hands shake. The figure wasn't just standing there, it was looking directly at the camera. Its face was a mirror image of Elias's own face, but it looked different. It looked exhausted. It looked terrified. And its eyes were wide, as if it were trying to scream, but had no mouth to do so. Elias stared at the image for over an hour. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it's a double exposure? No, digital cameras don't really do that unless you program them to, and he hadn't. Maybe it's a reflection? There were no reflective surfaces on that mountain ledge. Maybe it was a prank? But he was alone. He had heard no footsteps, smelled no smoke, felt no presence. Then he noticed the most impossible detail of all. In the photo, the ghost version of Elias was holding something in its hand. It was a small silver object. Elias leaned in until his nose was inches from the monitor. It was a silver whistle, a high-frequency emergency whistle that Elias kept attached to his keychain. Elias reached for his keys on the desk. He fumbled through them. His heart stopped. The whistle was missing. He remembered having it that morning. He remembered the jingle of it as he hiked, but looking at his keychain now, the small silver ring where the whistle usually hung was empty. It hadn't just fallen off. The metal ring had been pulled open as if someone or something had physically removed it. The second descent. Elias didn't sleep that night. He sat in his recliner, the fire dying down to embers, watching that photo on his monitor. He was a man of logic, and logic told him there was only one way to solve this. He had to go back. He told himself he had dropped the whistle. He told himself the photo was a glitch, a 1 in a million sensor error that happened to look like him. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. The next morning, Wednesday, Elias was back at the trailhead at 5:30 in the morning. He didn't bring his tripod this time. He brought a heavy flashlight and a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He hiked faster than he ever had before. He pushed his 58-year-old body until his knees throbbed and his breath came in ragged gasps. He reached the ledge at 8:45 in the morning. The weather was identical to the day before. The same thick mist, the same damp smell of pine, the same eerie silence. Elias walked to the exact spot where he had stood for the photo. He looked toward the hemlock trees where the figure had appeared. "Hello?" he called out. His voice was swallowed by the fog. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Elias began to search the ground. He looked for the whistle. He looked for footprints. He looked for any sign that another human being had been there. The ground was rocky and covered in a thin layer of moss. There were his own footprints from the day before, clearly visible in a patch of soft dirt near the ledge. But as he looked closer at the area by the hemlock trees, he saw something that defied logic. There was a set of footprints. They were fresh. They were the exact size and tread of the boots Elias was currently wearing. But these footprints didn't lead to the trees. They didn't lead away from the trees. They simply existed in a circle around one specific spot, as if someone had been standing there pacing in a tiny confined space for hours. And there, in the center of those prints, resting on a bed of damp moss, was the silver whistle. Elias picked it up. It was ice cold. As his fingers closed around the metal, he felt a sudden, violent jolt of electricity shoot up his arm. It wasn't a static shock. It was a physical sensation of being pulled like a hook had caught in his chest and was dragging him toward the edge of the cliff. He stumbled, dropping the whistle. He gasped, clutching his chest, and that's when the mist began to swirl. The fog didn't just move with the wind, it began to thicken and darken, turning a bruised purple color. Elias looked back toward his camera, or where his camera would have been yesterday, and he saw it. A tripod. His tripod. But he hadn't brought it today. He looked through the hazy air and saw a man standing by the tripod. The man had his back to Elias. He was wearing a charcoal gray fleece jacket. He was looking out over the ledge. Elias realized with a surge of pure horror that he was looking at himself from the day before. He tried to shout, but no sound came out. He tried to run toward the figure to warn him, to tell him to leave, but his legs felt like they were moving through deep water. He felt a weight on his back, his backpack, and he realized he was now wearing the neon green rain cover that he hadn't put on this morning. He looked down at his hand. He was holding the whistle. In that moment, Elias Thorne, the man of logic, realized he was no longer in the present. He was the figure in the photo. He was the ghost. He was trapped in a pocket of time that had folded back on itself, a glitch in the blueprints of the universe that he had spent his life believing were unbreakable. He watched as the yesterday version of himself turned around and walked back to the tripod. He watched as his past self checked the digital screen, smiled with satisfaction, and began to pack up. "Wait!" Elias screamed, but it was a silent plea. As the past version of Elias turned to walk down the trail, he glanced back one last time. For a split second, their eyes met. The Elias from yesterday looked confused, perhaps seeing a shimmer in the air, a trick of the light. Then he simply turned and disappeared into the fog. The impossible return. Elias Thorne was found 3 days later. He wasn't found at the bottom of a cliff. He wasn't found dead of exposure. He was found by a pair of young hikers sitting on a bench at the trailhead, the very beginning of the path. He was shivering. His clothes were bone dry despite the heavy rain that had fallen the night before, and he was staring at his hands. He couldn't tell the search and rescue teams how he had gotten there. He couldn't explain where he had been for 72 hours. When they took him to the hospital in Olympia, the doctors found something they couldn't explain. Elias was suffering from severe dehydration, which made sense, but he also had a localized radiation burn on his right palm, the exact shape of a small rectangular object. The police recovered his SUV from the parking lot. Inside, they found his camera. When they developed the files, the ones from that Tuesday, they found the self-portrait Elias had obsessed over. In the photo, Elias is standing at the edge of the cliff. In the background, near the trees, there is a figure. But in this version of the photo, the one the police saw, the figure isn't just a blurry shape, it is a crystal clear image of Elias Thorne, looking exactly as he did when he was found 3 days later. Older, gray-haired, and wearing a look of such profound sorrow that one of the officers had to turn the screen away. But the most chilling detail was the timestamp. The digital file for the photo of Elias says it was taken on Tuesday, October 14th at 9:17 in the morning. However, the ghost figure in the background, the one holding the whistle, is wearing a hospital wristband on his right arm. A wristband that hadn't been manufactured yet, a wristband with a date printed on it that was 3 days in the future. Elias Thorne never went back to the mountains. He sold his house in Seattle and moved to the desert of Arizona, where the air is dry and the horizon is always visible. He stopped taking photos, he stopped looking at blueprints, because Elias finally found the data point that changed his entire equation. He realized that logic only works if time moves in a straight line. And sometimes, on a misty morning in the woods, that line loops back and grabs you by the throat. To this day, if you ask Elias about that trip to Mount Eleanor, he won't say a word. He'll just reach into his pocket and pull out a small silver whistle. It's pitted and worn, as if it has aged 50 years in the span of a single afternoon. And if you look closely at his right palm, you can still see the scar. A perfect, silver-colored burn that reminds him every single day that some things are not meant to be captured on camera. Hi there, welcome back to my channel. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place. Because today, we are going to look at a case that challenges the very fabric of our reality. A story that suggests the world we see might be far thinner and more fragile than we ever dared to imagine. The man who saw too much. To understand what happened on that chilly afternoon in late October of 1972, you have to understand a man named Elias Thorne. Now, Elias was not a man prone to flights of fancy. He was 45 years old, a former logistics officer for the United States Army, and at the time of our story, he worked as a long-haul delivery driver for a high-end furniture manufacturer based out of Seattle, Washington. Elias was a man of routines. He liked his coffee black, his maps paper, and his schedules precise. He had driven the winding, fog-drenched back roads of the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years. He knew every curve of the highway, every flickering neon sign of every roadside diner, and most importantly, he knew the village of Oak Haven. Oak Haven wasn't on most maps. It was one of those tiny, self-contained communities tucked deep into a valley within the Cascade Range. It consisted of exactly 42 houses, a small general store, a chapel with a white steeple that looked like a needle piercing the gray sky, and a population of roughly 150 souls. Elias visited Oak Haven once every 2 weeks to deliver specialty upholstery supplies to a local craftsman named Silas Vane. On Tuesday, October the 24th, 1972, at exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Elias pulled his heavy truck off the main logging road and onto the gravel path that led into the heart of the village. Everything was exactly as it should have been. As he rolled down the main street at 15 miles per hour, he saw Mrs. Gable hanging wet laundry on a line behind her blue cottage. He saw 3 young boys, maybe 10 or 11 years old, kicking a scuffed leather soccer ball in the grass near the chapel. He even smelled the distinct, sweet aroma of wood smoke and Proof's Bakery, where the owner was surely pulling a fresh tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven. Elias pulled his truck to a stop in front of Silas Vane's workshop. He engaged the parking brake, the heavy hiss of the air brakes echoing off the surrounding hills. He looked at his watch. It was 2:15. He was exactly 3 minutes ahead of schedule, the first heartbeat. Elias hopped out of the cab, his boots crunching on the familiar gray gravel. He walked to the back of the trailer, pulled his heavy ring of keys from his pocket, and prepared to unlock the rolling door. But as he reached for the handle, he realized he had left the delivery manifest, the paperwork Silas needed to sign on the passenger seat of the cab. He let out a short, annoyed huff. He turned around and walked the 20 feet back to the front of the truck. He opened the passenger door, reached across the seat, and grabbed the clipboard. As he grabbed the board, he felt a strange sensation. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't a physical touch. It was a sudden, violent shift in the air pressure, like the way your ears pop when a plane descends too quickly. That was the first heartbeat. He didn't think much of it. He chalked it up to a sudden gust of mountain wind, or perhaps a head cold he felt coming on. He stepped back down from the cab and slammed the door shut. The second heartbeat. Elias turned back toward the village, clipboard in hand. He took one step, and then it happened again. This time, the sensation was accompanied by a flash of light so brief that he wasn't sure if he'd actually seen it or if his brain had just misfired. It was like a camera flash going off in a pitch-black room. His heart gave a singular heavy thud against his ribs, the second heartbeat. And then there was the silence. Now, Elias Thorne was a man who understood the silence of the woods. He knew the difference between the quiet of a snowy night and the stillness of a summer evening. But this was different. This was the silence of a vacuum. There was no wind, there were no birds, there was no sound of the soccer ball hitting the grass. Elias looked up from his clipboard, and his brain simply stopped functioning for a moment. He experienced what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. His eyes were sending information to his brain, but his brain was flatly refusing to accept it. The workshop of Silas Vane was gone. Not burned down, not collapsed, gone. In its place stood a massive, ancient Douglas fir tree. Its trunk was at least 6 feet wide, and its roots were gnarled and deep, covered in a thick, velvety layer of emerald green moss. Elias looked down the street toward Mrs. Gable's blue cottage. There was no cottage, there was no laundry line, there was only a dense, impenetrable thicket of ferns and vine maple. Elias began to spin in a circle, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The chapel, the general store, the bakery, the 42 houses, all of it had vanished. Where the paved and gravel Main Street had been moments ago, there was now only a forest floor so old and undisturbed that it looked as if a human being had not set foot there in 1,000 years. The soccer ball? Gone. The boys? Gone. Elias screamed out for Silas. He screamed for Mrs. Gable, but his voice didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly by the heavy, damp atmosphere of a primeval forest. He looked down at his feet. He was standing on a patch of dirt and pine needles. His truck, the massive 10-ton delivery vehicle, was still there. It was the only thing that remained. But it wasn't sitting on a road. Its tires were sunk 6 inches into the soft, loamy earth of the forest floor, as if it had been dropped there by a giant hand. The impossible evidence. Elias Thorne did what any rational man would do when faced with the impossible. He scrambled back into his truck, started the engine with trembling hands, and tried to drive away. But there was nowhere to go. The road he had driven in on the gravel path that connected Oakhaven to the outside world was gone. In every direction, there was only dense, old-growth timber. He spent the next 4 hours wandering in a state of shock, clutching his clipboard like a holy relic. He eventually found a trail, a narrow, overgrown deer path that led him toward the higher ridge. By the time he reached the logging road 5 miles away, his clothes were torn and his eyes were wild. When the local sheriff, a man named Miller, found Elias stumbling down the highway at 9 o'clock that night, he thought he was dealing with a drunk or a victim of a hit and run. But when Elias told his story, Sheriff Miller's expression shifted from pity to deep, unsettling confusion. "Elias," the sheriff said, sitting him down in the back of the patrol car, "I've lived in this county for 55 years. My father was the sheriff before me. There has never been a village called Oakhaven in these mountains." Elias shook his head violently. "I've been there every 2 weeks for 15 years. Miller, Silas Vane. You know Silas. He makes the chairs for the courthouse." Sheriff Miller looked at his deputy, then back at Elias. Silas Vane died in 1921, Elias. He was a woodworker, sure. But his shop was in the town of Miller's Creek, 30 miles from here, and it burned to the ground 50 years ago. The investigation. The following morning, a full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Elias led a team of 12 deputies and 3 forest rangers back to the spot where he had left his truck. They found it. The truck was exactly where Elias said it would be, idling in the middle of a forest that shouldn't have been traversable by a vehicle of that size. There were no tire tracks leading to the truck. It was as if the truck had simply materialized in the center of a grove of trees that were, according to the rangers, at least 300 years old. But it was what they found near the truck that defied every law of logic. One of the deputies noticed something shiny caught in the roots of a large cedar tree, right where Elias claimed the general store had stood. He reached down and pulled it out. It was a small brass bell, the kind you might find above a door to announce a customer's entry. It was polished and bright, as if it had been cleaned that morning. When the deputy shook it, it let out a clear, melodic ring. Next to the bell, lying on a bed of dry moss, was a fresh cinnamon roll. It was still warm. The search party stood in a circle around the pastry, the steam rising from it in the cold mountain air. One of the rangers, a man who had spent 40 years studying the growth patterns of the Cascades, knelt down and examined the ground. He took a soil sample and ran it through his fingers. "This soil hasn't been disturbed," the ranger whispered, his voice trembling. "Look at the lichen on these rocks. Look at the way these ferns have grown. This forest hasn't seen a building or a road in at least 3 centuries. It's impossible." And yet, there was the truck, there was the bell, there was the warm bread. The search for the 150, the authorities didn't stop there. They checked the census records, they checked tax filings, they checked postal routes. In the official records of the United States of America, Oak Haven did not exist. There was no record of a Mrs. Gable, there was no record of the 42 houses. It was as if an entire community, with its friendships, its heartaches, its laundry days, and its soccer games, had been wiped not just from the earth, but from history itself. Elias Thorne was never the same. He was committed to a psychiatric facility in Seattle for 3 months, but he was eventually released when the doctors realized he wasn't crazy, he was just a man whose reality had broken. He spent the rest of his life obsessively researching the history of the Cascade Range. He found hundreds of stories of disappearing places, the lost village of the Bennington Triangle, the vanishing Inuit village of Lake Angakuni, but those were different. Those were cases where the people vanished, but the buildings remained. In Oak Haven, the buildings had vanished too. The very time had vanished. The final discovery. Before Elias Thorne passed away in the year 2005, he gave one final interview to a local journalist who was interested in urban legends. He was 81 years old, living in a small apartment filled with maps and yellowed newspaper clippings. The journalist asked him, "Elias, after all these years, what do you really think happened in those 2 heartbeats?" Elias looked out the window, his eyes focusing on something far beyond the city skyline. "I don't think they went anywhere," Elias said softly. "I think I was the one who moved. I think for 15 years I was slipping through a crack in the world. I was visiting a place that existed in a different version of our reality. And on that Tuesday, at 2:15, the crack simply closed." But then, Elias reached into his bedside drawer and pulled out a small, tattered piece of paper. It was the delivery manifest he had grabbed from his truck on that fateful afternoon. On the bottom of the page, in the section for the recipient's signature, there was a fresh, ink-black scrawl. It was the signature of Silas Vane. But it wasn't the signature itself that haunted Elias for 33 years. It was what was written in the date column. In clear, elegant handwriting, the date was listed as October 24th, 2172. 200 years in the future. Elias Thorne died 2 days later. The truck was eventually dismantled and hauled out of the woods piece by piece, as there was no road to drive it out on. The Douglas fir trees continued to grow, their rings marking the passage of decades over a spot where, for 2 heartbeats, a village had existed, or perhaps where a village is still waiting to be built. So, the next time you're driving down a lonely back road and you feel the air pressure change, or you see a flash of light that shouldn't be there, you might want to keep your eyes on the road, because you never know when the world might decide to blink. And if you're interested in more stories that defy logic and explore the darkest corners of the unexplained, I can certainly delve into the mystery of the time-slip hikers of the Ural Mountains, or perhaps the strange disappearance of the cargo ship MV Joyita.